the Mi-24 pitch and roll autopilot. It is way better than the H64 autopilot in my opinion, and here's why. To keep it simple, the pitch and roll autopilot has three things that decide its deflection. 1. Attitude hold. While it's off, think of it as a caged gyroscope constantly being fed your pitch and roll attitude. And when you turn it on, it will hold that current attitude. So when you turn it on the ground, it's holding you at the 3.5 degrees nose up attitude that you naturally are at on the ground. If your generators turn off and you turn it back on in a turn, it will hold you in that turn. And when you maneuver from the attitude that's holding, eventually it hits its limit of max authority and stops stabilizing you. To best explain the next part, it might be best to look at the perspective of the engineers at Mill. For the Mi-6 and 8, they needed a way to not constantly hit the limit of the pitch and roll attitude holds when maneuvering. So they gave us these dials to change its deflection, as seen in the servo spindle deflection windows that show us how the autopilot is moving. By moving the dials to change its deflection back to center when at their limits, the flight engineer is stopping it from hitting its limit every time you roll or pitch around a lot. But this isn't a job the Mi-24 flight engineer can do. And so they needed it to be done by the pilot somehow, in an easy and invisible way. The solution to this was to have your trim button effectively turn off the autopilot when pressed and turn it back on when released. This way, every time the pilot trimmed, it would reset the attitude hold to their current attitude, which I think is just brilliant, as Soviet and Russian pilots are constantly trimming if you listen to cockpit videos of them. And yes, those of you who fly the K-50 might recognize that it uses the exact same solution, using the trim switch to tell the autopilot what attitude you want it to hold. And Mi-24 and K-50 pilots will be well familiar with one of the headaches of this approach though, the nodding or pitch jumping issue that happens when trimming after an attitude change. So let's say we take off. On the ground, turning it on stabilizes you at your ground nose angle of 3.5 degrees nose up. Then you pitch down to fly forward with forward cyclic. Since it's stabilizing you at 3.5 degrees nose up, you need extra forward cyclic to fight the attitude hold as you pitch the nose down. And when you trim, the autopilot is now holding your current attitude, and the forward cyclic you needed to fight the attitude hold before is no longer needed, causing you to pitch down. It's the same if, say, slowing down on landing. You trim nose up, and the nose will jump upwards after trimming as you basically recenter the attitude hold, changing the amount of cyclic needed. There are 2 or 3 principal ways to get around this. 1. The K-50 way. Hold trim while you maneuver. That way there is no extra cyclic to fight the attitude hold. But I think this only really works for spring sticks. For force feedback, where all your force goes away with trim, I find it not optimal at all. Similarly, when you pitch your nose down and trim, instead of just hitting the trim button fast, you could hold it for a few seconds, stabilize your helicopter, move your cyclic, and then release it a few seconds later. 2. My preferred way. Instead of trimming once, trim rapidly 2 to 3 times. Spam that trim button until you are fully stable. Yeah, pressing it once might result in a pitch jump or a nod. Then trim again. Still not perfectly stable? Trim again! You can't trim too much! The only other thing you really need to worry about is trimming with zero roll angle, or else it will try to hold your roll angle and you'll slowly turn. That is, unless you want to trim it so it constantly turns you. As for the trim hat, I'll cover that later. 2. Okay, that's all for the attitude hold. But, the second input-output of the pitch roll autopilot, and this one's pretty simple. It will dampen changes in angular speed exactly like a dampener or a stability system. I find it interesting that usually attitude holds and dampeners are separate, but the engineers decided to combine them here. 3. The third input-output of the pitch roll autopilots. These are called compensation sensors. Let's, again, go back to the minds of the Mi-6 and 8 engineers. They had an autopilot that held attitude and dampened movement, but they needed the flight engineer to constantly move the knobs so the attitude holds wouldn't hit its limits when maneuvering. What could they do to make it hit these limits less? So, they put in transducers that measure the movement of the cyclic. And when you move the cyclic from the spot the cyclic was in when you turned it on, or the spot the cyclic was in when you trimmed in the Mi-24, it would move the attitude hold the same direction you moved the cyclic. Here's another way to put it. Your cyclic is commanding the autopilot and helping your maneuvers. So if anyone tells you, oh, I fly without the pitch roll AP because it makes me more maneuverable, tell them about the compensation sensors and how they actually help you maneuver. In order to do this, it needs to know where your neutral or center cyclic point is currently. So wherever your cyclic is when you turn it on, it takes that as center, and any movement from that spot moves the attitude hold. And in the Mi-24, it's the same thing if you trim. Wherever the stick is when I trim is the new center, and any movement from that spot commands the autopilot to move the same way. If I turn it on or trim on the ground with the cyclic back and right, it takes that as the center, and any movement from that point will move the attitude holds with the cyclic. One way to easily see how this works is to follow the pre-flight autopilot check. In real-life procedure, you would check the autopilot by moving your cyclic around on the ground. If the autopilot moves with your cyclic, then your autopilot works. And you'll see that when you trim, it goes back to center, and any movement from there will now move the autopilot instead. That's why they are called compensation sensors. They are compensating the attitude hold to your cyclic position to help you maneuver and hit the limits of the autopilot less. Now, we also have a hat trimmer. Why not just use it instead of the trim button, you may ask? Well, the hat trim doesn't move the attitude holds. So only using the hat trim will lead you to quickly hit the limits of the autopilot deflection, making you less stable and less maneuverable. My suggestions: you don't really need to use the hat trim for pitch. Just handle it with the trim button. But you will notice that no matter how much you trim with zero roll, it's nearly impossible to get it perfectly stable on the roll axis. In addition, our big wing has 12 degrees anhedral, which makes it very roll unstable. So I use the hat trim almost entirely for roll to keep that roll level. Just trim at 0 degrees roll so it's close, and do the rest with the hat trim. Also, not very important, but the trim hat, while it won't change the attitude hold, it will adjust the zero position of your compensation sensors. So at least it does that. I still think it's not so good to use it for the pitch channel because you'll hit the limits of its deflection easily. But you can see this work on the ground. Move the stick right and the compensation sensors will move the attitude hold right. Then hold right hat trim and you'll see your autopilot roll deflection go back to 0, as by holding right hat trim you are telling it you want right cyclic to be your new 0 cyclic position. Well, that's basically it. To get the full understanding, here is some extra information. You will notice that the pitch channel is very aggressive. It is 3 times more aggressive than in the Mi-8. Without moving the cyclic, it goes from 0 to max deflection in 5 degrees. Moving the cyclic will add 5 degrees to that. So when moving your nose with the cyclic after trimming, it will go from 0 to max deflection in 10 degrees. So if you need to nose down more than 10 degrees to attack someone, more than 10 degrees from where you're trimmed, the pitch autopilot will be at its limit and bottomed out, so to say, and no longer able to stabilize you. One thing I do for high rate of fire gun runs, I trim with my pipper near the target. This way, the pitch autopilot is fighting the recoil with all its might, reducing recoil and getting more bullets on target faster. You just have to remember to trim again for cruise after, or the attitude hold will keep trying to pull your nose down. But it's worth it for the anti-recoil use. Roll isn't really that important, as you should usually almost always be trimming for a 0 roll, but normally it hits its limits in 12 degrees, and the compensation sensors will move the attitude hold limits to 40 degrees. As always, make sure your control helper is off. And yeah, that's about it. With this knowledge, use your trim button to make you the master and the autopilot the slave. Force it to obey your will as you change pitch with flight speed changes and destroy targets.